A feud over the leadership of Libya's central bank has led to the suspension of oil production. The two rival governments are trading blame for the standoff. Which has the upper hand, and what does it mean for Libya's economy and security? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Libya's central bank, which controls billions of dollars in oil revenue, is at the centre of the latest political dispute. The governor has fled the country, fearing for his life. Staff say they've been threatened by armed groups, and banking services are interrupted. Libya has two rival governments which have fought for power, influence and control of its vast oil reserves for more than a decade. This week, the internationally recognised government in the West replaced the central bank governor. The administration in the East, which operates most of the oil fields, objected and halted production. The National Oil Corporation reported losses of more than $120 million in just 3 days. So how will this latest feud affect the economy, and is it taking Libya closer to civil war once again? We'll explore all these issues with our panel of guests who join us in a moment. But first, this report from Katia Lopez-Hodoyan.
Security forces stand guard outside Libya's central bank in Tripoli. Rival factions are locked in a power struggle over who controls the institution and the country's oil revenue. Banks have suspended operations and people can't access their cash.
We demand that all banking procedures return to normal. As far as the political problems and the competition over the leadership of the central bank, they should resolve these among themselves. Citizens should be able to go about their banking as usual.
It's the latest fallout in a divided nation. Back in 2011, longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown during the Arab Spring. Political disputes followed, leading to the formation of two rival governments. One is based in Tripoli, in the west, internationally recognized and led by Prime Minister Abdul Hamid al-Dabaiba. The other is based in Benghazi, in the east, and supports warlord Khalifa Haftar, who controls most of Libya's oil fields. And for years, both sides have depended on the central bank for survival.
In a country where oil is the lifeblood, we should think of the central bank as being the heart that pumps that wealth through the system. And if whoever controls that central bank is going to control which of those two rival factions is going to thrive and which one of them is going to wither.
The two administrations compete for power, shifting alliances with armed groups. Unrest has surged recently, fueling political instability and disputes over resources.
The status quo is not sustainable. In the absence of renewed political talks leading to a unified government and elections, you see where this is heading.
In the fallout, central bank governor Sadiq al-Kabir has fled the country. The Tripoli-based presidential council accused him of mismanaging funds and forced him out. Now the rival government in the east has promised to halt oil production until Kabir is reinstated. So far, the country's output has dropped more than 50% to around 700,000 barrels per day.
They've shut down the central bank and left people in a terrible state. Just look around. The shops are empty, there are no services, nothing at all.
Now a divided Libya is bracing for what could be yet another power struggle, which could worsen an already fragile situation. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss the situation in Libya further now, as we're joined by today's panel of guests. And in Benghazi, we have Faraj Najem, a historian and political researcher. He's the author of Tribe, Islam and the State in Libya. In Palermo, Italy, is Claudia Gazzini. She's a senior Libya analyst at the International Crisis Group. Her research focuses on Libyan security, politics and economic governance. And in Tripoli, Mustafa Fattouri, an independent Libyan academic and award-winning journalist. Thank you, all of you, for joining us on today's programme. So, a row about the head of the central bank. When you say it like that, Faraj, it doesn't sound particularly serious, but it is, isn't it? It's a crisis.
Well, it is a crisis. It's one of those catalog of crises, if you like, that we've been suffering since the revolution, but also the institutional and political split since 2014. This is a problem that has been going on, as I said, since 2014 with the central bank. It's been dominated by one man. And apparently now he has been overthrown by his former allies and backers. So this is just another, to Libyans, this is just another crisis that we have to live with.
Claudia, let me ask you, do you think this is something that could potentially even bring Libya to fresh conflict?
Well, so far, we've seen armed mobilization not lead to conflict. I mean, there's been confrontation, there's been tension, but we haven't seen an outright war, in large part because for the past year or more, there's very little appetite to bring the country back to war. I think the major risk in this current moment is to see a major repercussion of this feud over the central bank on the Libyan economy. And that means more difficult living conditions for Libyans and possibly a paralysis of the Libyan economy.
Mustafa, I read an article that you wrote recently on the Middle East Monitor website, and you looked at the events at this time in August 13 years ago. That was when Gaddafi was toppled. I was in Tripoli at the time, and I was actually in Tripoli as well when he was killed in the October. You say there are striking similarities with today. Explain.
Yeah, sure, James. Thank you for having me, first of all. And the big similarities I see actually have to do with the economy because of the sanctions at the time, back in 2011, making living conditions for most Libyans quite difficult. The shortages of basics in the capital, especially in the capital at the time, as well as the long queues around the petrol and gas stations for people to fill their cars. And the other similarity was a little bit difficulty of with the cash money, getting them from the banks. It wasn't, despite the war and everything, it wasn't back in 2011. It wasn't as bad as we have seen in later years, like in 2015 and 2017, and even this year, a couple of months ago. And the other similarity is the loss of control over the government or the state institutions, despite the fact that the central bank itself, back in 2011, was firmly under control of the government. And even when Bengdara, the governor at the time, chose to flee the country early on, actually in February, when troubles started, a new replacement was immediately appointed, and everything went smoothly until the end of the war in October. Well, of course, not smoothly, but whatever happened after that, after March 2011, was due to the war itself. It's nothing to do with the policies, the government, except with the situation that have to do with the demonstrations and the NATO intervention, of course, which destroyed much of the country. And, Hollywood, if you like, most of the government, the state institutions, getting them to the point where they are today.
Yeah, well, let's look at where we are today. Let's back up a little bit for those that are watching us today, Faraj, because you are in Benghazi. We have Mustafa in Tripoli, and you're in the second city. He's in the capital, but you have different governance. You have different people running those two halves of the country. In Tripoli, you have the UN-recognised government, Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dubeiba. In Benghazi, you have an Eastern administration, and the main person there is the warlord General Khalifa Haftar. It's not one country, really, is at the moment, the way it's being run, is it, Faraj?
No, it is one nation. It's one country, but it's two states and two capitals, if you like, and two governments. One government is unelected, which is chosen by the international community. The other government, which is in Benghazi, it's picked and backed by the parliament, by the latest or the last elected parliament, still in the country.
Elected a very
Yes,
elected a very long time ago, though, Faraj. This is the problem, isn't it?
Yes,
There are all these leftover
elected
institutions from different international efforts to try and rebuild the country, and the latest elections that the international community planned never even happened.
Well, you can interpret the way you want it, but it has been elected. It was elected by the people of Libya when they had the opportunity to go for elections. They have not had since, and that's why they had this government here and they had this parliament here. Do I agree with it? That's another question. But again, this is where you are. You have, as I said, two states. You have two parallel institutions, central bank over there, central bank over here. You have an army here in the east in Benghazi, which is under the umbrella of the parliament, whereas you have a collection of militias running the Tripoli, and we've seen the latest evicting the governor, the bank governor. And here you are. This is what you have. This is a sad situation.
Claudia, if you look at the country and its natural resources, this is a relatively small population, under 7 million people. It's a very big country, much of it's desert, but most of them live at the very north of the country, on the Mediterranean coast, and it has, or should have, vast wealth, should it not?
Libya is a very wealthy country.
Claudia, please.
Libya is a very wealthy country and has been, because it produces 1.4 million barrels of oil a day. The reserves of the Libyan central bank, of the Libyan state, are over $80 billion. It generates about between 20 and $25 billion of oil revenues a year. So these are big numbers compared to other neighboring states. And as you said, it's a very small population. The problem is that over the years, there have been repeated accusations of mismanagement of funds, embezzlement, and what a former UN envoy called outright predation of state resources. So you have state officials that are actually using their positions of power to tap into these oil revenues. Things have gotten even worse.
Claudia, then, given all that, what is interesting to me is that given you've got these two rival institutions, two rival governments, there is only one central bank. That seems to be the only institution that is common, and that seems to be why we have this really big problem right now.
Well, let's say the central bank is nominally unified, even though de facto it isn't, only for the past year and a half. It has been divided into two rival branches since 2014, when the country first split politically. So the political divisions brought with it a split of the central bank. One was internationally recognized, the headquarters in Tripoli, governed by Sadiq al-Kabir, who's been the governor, officially recognized governor since 2011, and another rival branch based in Benghazi, who had its own governor, but was not internationally recognized. So the central bank has been divided. In the past 2 years, there's been an agreement, in part because of rekindled ties between authorities in eastern Libya and the governor Sadiq al-Kabir. There has been an agreement that the East-appointed deputy governor, a gentleman by the name of Marai Barasi, would be recognized as such by Sadiq al-Kabir. So only in the past year and a half has there been a sort of a newfound friendship over the management, a centralized management of the central bank. Of course, this is also because funds have increasingly been being directed also to the Eastern authorities, which for years have been sort of starved of state funds and have accused the governor in Tripoli of not giving them the money. The parliament was not receiving the money, nor rival authorities in the East. So this feud that is erupting today is actually a change of the alliance structure in Libya. For many years, for almost a decade, it was those in the East who were accusing the governor in Tripoli of starving them off. They wanted him changed. And now, because there's a refound friendship, they are the ones defending the governor and actually opposing the decision of the Tripoli-based authorities to sack him. So it's actually, we've come full circle in the feud over the central bank.
Mustafa, then, there was this understanding, all very tense, but it's broken down, and it seems the dispute at the end was between the governor, Al-Kabir, and the Tripoli government. The governor, I think, was unhappy with the spending levels of the Tripoli government, concerned about corruption. Dbeba's government felt the governor had amassed too much power. Is that the sort of tension we're talking about? Who was in the right, who was in the wrong, in your view, Mustafa?
Well, that's part of it. The way you put it, James, that's part of the reasons of the tensions between the two sides, Mr. Kabir on the one side and the Prime Minister on the other side, the Prime Minister in Tripoli, of course, Mr. Dbeiba. But there's also the changing alliances, political alliances, as the previous speaker have mentioned, which are shifting all the time. And we have seen some kind of a shift lately when it comes to the alliances that support Mr. Al-Kabir as well as Mr. Dbeiba at the same time. For example, in terms of armed groups in Tripoli, Mr. Al-Kabir was always protected by the deterrent forces, or Radab in Arabic, and the same people are aligned to the Prime Minister, Mr. Dbeiba, and unlike in previous years. But the issue here is actually also have to do with two things, I think. First of all, the legitimacy of all institutions, including Mr. Kabir's position as a governor, and two, the legality of what they are doing. And these are big question marks. And when you look at what happened with the governor over the last 2 weeks, this is a man who was dismissed from his job twice before by the same authority that appointed him, which is the parliament. First time in 2014 and the second time in 2018. And we have to remember he has been in that position since October 2011. That's a very long time, plus completely failed in managing the financial policy of the country, managing the value of the dinar, which has been plummeting for the whole decade or so, managing the funds available to him, and above all, for the ordinary people in the streets here in the capital or somewhere else in Tripoli, somewhere else in the country. The main problem is he has been failing them in terms of availability of cash and widely available banking services. The banking services in the country are terrible. There are no ATM machines, enough of them at least. I think in the whole capital where I am, there's only probably 10 to 15 such machines, and most of them on the average day, they don't work at all. And you really have to queue
those are what you say are his shortcomings. Faraj, though, the way he was got rid of, he had to flee the country, was very, very ugly, wasn't it? There were sieges of the headquarters of the central bank. There was the head of the IT department was kidnapped. There were threats made. There were children of staff threatened with being kidnapped. And in the end, he had to flee the country.
Well, the way that he was kicked out, to say the least, was unconstitutional according to the Libyan constitutional declaration. And it was not the procedure that normally in a civil country you would do it. However, I'm happy to see the back of him and to see him out of the country. But I wouldn't like to do it the way they have done it. It has given this institution a bad name, and it has caused even bigger friction between the rivals in Libya. And as the colleagues have explained, now we are entrenched in both banks of the arguments.
And Claudia, what's happened now is that the Eastern government, which is where most of the oil fields are based, have shut down the oil ports. They've shut down the production. Tell us, is this something you think could go on for some considerable time? And what are the effects already on the Libyan economy? How worrying is it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me say, for somebody who's been following Libya for over 10 years, just the idea that the Eastern-based authorities and the Haftar-based forces, Haftar-led forces, shut the oil installations to protest against the sacking of the governor, who was their arch enemy for many, many years, is somewhat, surprising. But the repercussions are going to be, the repercussions will be there. I expect this closure to last, to go on until there is a settlement of this dispute. Of course, the East-based authorities want to see the Presidential Council, so the Tripoli-based authorities, backtrack on their decision and reinstitute, or at least have some kind of face-saving declaration that reinstitutes Sadiq al-Kabir as the governor. So I expect the closure to go on for some time. We're not seeing any signs of this finding a common ground, despite the fact that the UN acting envoy, Stephanie Khoury, asked for a meeting to take place in recent days. We saw the State Department issue a very strong statement just earlier today, condemning the fact that these moves on the central bank were done without consensus. So the risk going forward is not only the stopping of oil flows and therefore the shortage of revenues. I mean, oil has gone down from 1.4 million barrels a day to around 500,000 barrels of production a day. So the relative income is also lost. But there's also the risk that if this confusion, as the US authorities refer to it, goes on, there might be some decision on an international level to close off transactions, which have been temporarily suspended with the Central Bank of Libya. So there's very little appetite of the international counterparts to deal with a central bank that is contested. So I think the risks are the closing of financial transactions until this dispute is resolved.
Mustafa, tell us how it feels right now in Tripoli. How worried are people about the situation? Is it affecting ordinary people's lives at this stage? How worried are they about the value of the Libyan dinar? How worried are they that, for example, salaries for people who work on the public payroll are going to get paid? I'm told that the figures are 2.4 million Libyans out of about 7 million are actually state employees.
Well, that's very true. Unfortunately, most people get paid from the government, and actually they don't do it any kind of work. But the situation in Tripoli, I haven't really noticed too much a change, with the exception of two things. One is the problems with the gas, around the gas stations, which, the distribution company, the government-owned distribution company, Brega, has been trying to reassure people that everything is fine and it has enough supplies in stocks, and much more is coming into the country, which is another irony. Libya, despite being a big oil producer, imports most of the refined products. It doesn't have enough refining capacity. That's one thing. The other thing is when it comes to banking. I noticed in the shops. I was at one of the big supermarkets yesterday in the city, and they have already announced the suspension of using payments, by any kind of bank cards, which is not widely available anyway. But wherever they used to be, they are stopped using them. I also, strangely enough, noticed that the dinar's value has not, fallen much more when comparing to other times of crisis, like 2 years ago or something. And the other thing I noticed is the prices have gone up, but the general mood of the population and the capital, at least, is people are very worried and they are confused.
Okay, Claudia, can I just bring you on people being worried? Do you think the international community is worried? You used to work as an advisor to the then head of the UN mission. It seems to me, back in 2020, we had world leaders having summits in Berlin talking about Libya. But there doesn't seem to be quite the same focus on Libya now. Has the world lost interest in Libya, and is that worrying in itself?
Well, for the past 2 years, it has to be said, the world has taken a step back on Libya, mainly because there was a comfortable status quo. There was no war. The two rival authorities, even though each had its own government and military coalition in the east and the west of the country, these two rival sort of entities were talking to each other behind closed doors. There were arrangements. There was a sort of a peaceful coexistence. And people thought, and many foreign capitals thought that, well, you know, Libya's not in such a bad place now. At least there's no war. And this is what caused people to and institutions to follow less Libya, also because the region is aflame with other conflicts. So there was this idea that this peaceful status quo, despite being dysfunctional, despite being precarious, it would continue. Now, with this recent crisis over the central bank, which I should repeat was rather unexpected, because there was always this assumption that the Dbeiba government in Tripoli was talking to the Haftar-dominated authorities in the east, and that there were deals taking place. There was always this idea that this coexistence will continue. So this crisis over the leadership of the central bank came a bit as a shock, and people are very concerned, very, very concerned.
Very concerned. Faraj, last word with you very briefly. Do you think further conflict can be avoided? How worried are you about the prospect of further conflict? Briefly, if you may.
I don't think there is a stamina or hunger for another conflicts. I think the current state of confederacy will carry on. The bank, in one way or another, I think, would be sorted out. But I don't think there will be a war.
OK, thank you very much, Faraj. Thank you to all our guests today, Faraj Najem, Claudia Gazzini and Mustafa Vettori. If you missed any of this programme or joined us late, you can always watch it again on our website, aljazeera.com. What issues should get the in-depth inside story treatment next time? Let us know on Facebook, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or, unless you're in Brazil, you can find us on X at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the production team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.